So still talking about some of the ways that we measure well-being or that we can conceptualize it, one approach is to look at well-being from this very micro level of psychological functioning and looking at this from the perspective of the positive psychology frames of thinking through well-being, which would be taking these very discrete indicators of what's happening in people's minds, like optimism, having experiences of joy, maybe love, experiencing life satisfaction, being motivated. So that would be a very micro level perspective on individual well-being. And of course, you'll all be familiar with this macro level perspective on well-being, where there's been a really important and useful surge of countries developing national frameworks to measure well-being in children and adults. Here on the screen, I'm displaying Ireland's well-being framework that was recently developed over the last 2 to 3 years in collaboration with many different partners in the Irish community and policy sector. And this is building off other international frameworks of well-being, such as the one that's been recently developed in New Zealand. But what about classical perspectives on well-being? So the philosophy of well-being, and here you'll all be familiar with the idea of Aristotelian well-being, where, and I'm illustrating it here with a quote that I found on a bench when I was taking a family holiday last year in the west coast of Ireland. And the quote reads, "Success is manufactured in the mind, while happiness is cultivated in the soul." And I thought this was a very, very nice description of the classical eudaimonic and hedonic well-being, where eudaimonic well-being is your sense of meaning and purpose in life. What do you contribute? What's your role in society? While hedonic well-being is the positive emotions that you feel as you make your way through life. Now, I think it's time for us to put our science hats on, because I'm just going to introduce something briefly. And if you don't want to think about this very deeply, you don't have to, okay? But as a developmental psychologist, this is a kind of thing that keeps me up late at night and keeps my brain active, and I love it. So I just want to say that in developmental theory, there is this idea of dynamical systems, which is used in many, many other scientific disciplines. And one of the hallmarks of dynamical systems, which is something to consider when we're measuring something like well-being, is that a dynamical system is made up of different parts. Like here, you can see the different oranges. So let's imagine well-being as a system that's made up of different components or parts. One of the problems with this from measurement theory is that when you put the parts together, they form a whole, but the whole is somehow unique in its own right. It is more than just the sum of its parts. So here I have this really nice illustration from a concept that Richard Lerner, who's a developmental psychologist from the US, wrote in one of his really early works in the 1980s that I found and pulled out, that you can't just put all of the oranges, these parts together, and then have a whole, because actually it transforms into something that's qualitatively unique, like a motorbike. So how can a bunch of oranges become a motorbike? Now, if you're not interested in that, you can forget about it. But for those of you in the audience and who are listening who are interested and intrigued about how well-being can be measured like dynamical systems, you can just remember the oranges and the motorbikes for later, okay?